Thank you, Lakeisha. There are 3 presenters in the section. Sorry. Oops. Advancing the slides here. There are 3 presenters in the session, with the first section being presented by Dr. Elena Bole, who's a senior physician with CDER in the US FDA. The second session will be presented by myself, Debbie Fox, and I'm a compliance specialist with Health Canada. And the third section will be presented by Mandy Budwell-Jaggett, who's the head of GCP for MHRA. Today, we will start by providing a general definition of what digital health technology is in the context of a clinical trial. And this will be followed by 3 different case studies, which also include some important compliance considerations when working with digital health technology. As you can see here, DHTs can encompass a wide variety of technologies and includes any instrument, tool, or platform that's utilized at any point in the data lifecycle of electronic data when that data is captured and reported as part of a clinical trial. So this would include computer systems, software applications, and input sensors and devices when they are involved in collecting, managing, transmitting, storing, and reporting electronic data. And this includes remote data acquisition tools. So some examples of DHTs include the following. So as mentioned, this includes data sensors, mobile apps, and data reporting, data computing platforms, as well as ePro devices and their software. It includes IRTs, wearables, and also includes the ECRF. So now I will hand things over to Elena Bole from the FDA to present a very interesting and relatable case. Over to you, Elena.
Thanks so much, Debbie. Hi, everyone. I am so excited to be here, and I welcome you to my talk about remote data acquisition. Please proceed, but do so with caution. I'd like to first start off my talk with a provision from the CFR. And basically what it says is that if you are going to use electronic systems for your trial, you must have procedures and controls in place that are designed to ensure the authenticity, the integrity, and the confidentiality of your records. Okay. So my goal today is to keep things relatable and straightforward. So here is my very complicated overview slide. I will first start by presenting the case, and then I'll talk about what happened, and then we will discuss the consequences for the application. And finally, I'll get to my take-home points, and I will suggest how to do better. My case today is a hypothetical case. However, I have created it using real findings from a real case. So what do we have? We have a new molecular entity, and the pivotal trial for the NDA was a single multi-center randomized double-blind placebo-controlled phase 3 trial. And what about the indication? Well, I write here just treatment of a disease because really this could be any disease where efficacy data comes from a clinical outcome assessment completed by the study participant using an app on a mobile device, also known as an ePro. So inspections, yes, we did them for 4 clinical investigators and the sponsor. And here's a little sneak preview. Efficacy endpoint data anomalies were noted by some of our statisticians. And more on that later, lots more on that. So on to the study design. After screening, baseline assessments were completed, which included an ePro assessment. In this case, the ePro was a disease severity questionnaire, and that was filled out by the participants using an app on a mobile device. Then participants were randomized in a 1-to-1 fashion to receive either the study drug or placebo, which they took for 12 months, full 12 months. And every month, they completed the ePro assessment, which was, in this case, a disease severity questionnaire. The primary efficacy endpoint was change from baseline to month 12 in disease severity. So we're just going to take a quick detour here. This is a session about DHT. So let's review some of the benefits of DHT for remote data acquisition. In general, I think we can all agree that DHTs are convenient, leading to improved participant recruitment, engagement, and retention. And then, of course, the real-time data collection that you have with DHT, it yields more meaningful data, avoiding recall bias. And DHTs allow for instantaneous transfer of data while maintaining the blind, and real-time data monitoring and outlier identification. These are all great things. As regulators, we appreciate that DHT can facilitate high-quality source data documentation, and that is data that adheres to the principles of data integrity, and we have a handy mnemonic for that, and that is ALCOA+, which means that ideally data should be attributable, legible, contemporaneous, original, accurate, plus complete, consistent, enduring, and available. Okay, so back to our case. What were the efficacy endpoint data anomalies identified by our statisticians? Well, the anomalies were unusual patterns in the ePro efficacy data. Efficacy data in some groups of participants had similar patterns of data missingness, and in other groups had similar data collection times. We couldn't find any explanation for this based on the protocol or issues reported during the trial. Luckily, for us anyway, the anomalies were noted early in the review cycle and helped us choose which clinical investigators to inspect. So in order to understand what went wrong, let's review what should have happened according to the protocol. So during the enrollment process, the clinical site staff was to assist participants with app installation on a mobile device, and then with app setup. And this required that the participant enter a default PIN, which was provided by the site staff, and then to enter a confidential PIN of their own choosing, which they would then use to access the app. Participants were then asked to choose 2 security questions and to provide answers to those questions. Participants were then given a help desk phone number that they were to call for technical support if they forgot their PIN and needed a PIN reset. In that case, they would need to provide the answers to their chosen security questions, and only then would they be permitted to reset their PIN. So I'd like to emphasize here that according to the user manual for the app, PINs, security questions, and answers should have been confidential. In other words, known only by the participant and not shared with anyone, not even the site staff. So, what the inspections found. So a majority of participants at the inspected sites used common PINs, or I should say identical PINs for their ePro app, or they used PINs that were based on their own birth date. But that's not all. Additionally, security questions and answer patterns were also discovered. At some sites, as you can see in this first table, participants had chosen a variety of security questions, but had used the same answer for all of them. And at other sites, as you can see in this next table, each participant had chosen the same 2 security questions and the same 2 specific answers for those security questions. So what actually happened? During our inspections, we learned that the site staff had provided instructions or suggestions to participants regarding PIN choice. That is, they guided participants to create PINs using specific memorable combinations of numbers, or to use PINs that were based on their own birth date that were easily known or already known by the site staff. Unfortunately, we gather no explanation for the unusual patterns found in the security questions and answers. But I'll share with you now that ultimately, an analysis by the sponsor revealed the same findings at a majority of sites for the study. Okay, so I know what you are all thinking. I think it's impossible to hear this story and not ask, why would this happen, right? So let's brainstorm. Okay, bear with me here, I'm trying hard. Perhaps site staff was serving as decision support for indecisive participants, those maybe who were challenged in thinking up their 4-digit PIN code. Or perhaps the site staff wanted to be a direct resource for participants who forgot their PINs. Or possibly, I might be reaching here, maybe they were anticipating that the help desk would provide inadequate assistance for participants who required a PIN reset, and they just wanted to be helpful. Or was the site staff establishing their own access to the participants' ePros? Well, we will never know for sure what happened, but the fact remains that when PINs and security questions should be confidential and they are not, that casts doubt on the attributability and therefore the reliability of the data collected on devices where those PINs were used. Let's now discuss the consequences for the NDA. Several FDA Form 483s were issued to clinical investigators, stating that the investigation was not conducted in accordance with the signed statement of the investigator and investigational plan. And as I just introduced, concerns about data reliability were there. So, and the review division, well, they decided that for those sites where both the efficacy data anomalies and protocol deviations related to EPRO access were found, well, the efficacy data from those sites, they would be excluded from the efficacy analysis. So the sponsor was then asked to resubmit their analysis without the excluded data, and that resulted in a major protocol amendment and a 3-month delay in FDA's review. And of course, we shared our findings with our fine colleagues across the globe. Hi, guys. Which prompted increased international scrutiny by other regulatory agencies. Okay, so here I'd like to take a moment to reflect, okay? So we have the situation, right? We have the situation where site staff played a role in PIN selection, which resulted in PINs that were not confidential. This behavior could have been isolated to this one clinical trial, or perhaps this behavior is more widespread, affecting most trials using apps if those apps required only PINs for access. Okay, so before you dismiss this idea entirely, hear me out. I think we have to consider the second possibility. And why do I say that? Well, I say that because of a well-documented phenomenon. We're all familiar with the notion of password oversaturation, right? I'm sure we all know people who use easy-to-remember passwords or don't keep their passwords confidential. So, just for fun, we have a poll, okay? This is a special poll. We're gonna do it in our heads, okay? Because it's a little bit private. So bear with me here, and everybody, please maintain your sense of humor. Okay, so for access to online accounts, websites, your computer, your phone, your ATM card, or even the safe in your home or the hotel you're staying at right now, which of the following is most true for you? I have used my birth date, name, cell phone number, or home address as my password. I have written down my passwords or shared them with others. I have used the same password more than once, or maybe you are perfect, okay? You have never, ever, ever, ever done any of these things. Okay, so in all seriousness, my point here is, we're all human, right? And so are the study participants, and so are the site staff. And we should really be able to anticipate this type of behavior when we design DHT and consider user management strategies. Okay, how to do better. So identify the critical to quality processes of your trial. That's where you should focus your time and your attention from the beginning. And because the efficacy endpoint data is so important, the processes that ensure endpoint data integrity, they're key. Ensure data attribution, and do that by selecting or designing DHT that is fit for purpose and engaging stakeholders in the design of DHT. Use robust access controls. Of course, there are many options to choose from, but examples that come to mind include biometrics and multi-factor authentication. Your goal is to achieve the intended security without greatly impacting user friendliness. Focus on user management processes and procedures. They're so important in all cases, no matter what access controls you use. And also focus on education and training and retraining site staff on the proper procedure for DHT, in this case, EPRO setup and EPRO use. For data monitoring, for efficacy data, we recommend centralized periodic data monitoring for anomalies to identify those situations where data may be coming from individuals other than the intended user. And for ePROs in particular, we recommend monitoring of user access information. And if you're using pins, well, you should be looking for common and birthday-based pins and unusual patterns for security questions and answers. So finally, I'm at my summary slide here. So my case today, it's a good example, right? It's a good example of how widespread protocol deviations regarding access controls can compromise your application by undermining data reliability. Please acknowledge this risk and safeguard your study's data. The sponsor is responsible for implementing the expectations for computerized systems to ensure that ePRO system data is reliable, and that includes effective access controls. Technological advances provide a variety of options for access controls. Explore the possibilities and choose wisely. Take proactive steps to decrease and manage risk, starting with selecting DHT that's fit for purpose, then employing risk proportionate system controls, and then providing ample education to site staff. And lastly, but certainly not least, monitor data throughout your trial. And that's all I have. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Elena. The next portion of the presentation is compliance fundamentals, including a case study of a hybrid system. I'll start with a quick refresher of some important compliance considerations and outline some of the fundamental requirements that should be in place for all digital health technologies. This will be followed by a case study that highlights the importance of ensuring that digital health technologies are validated for their intended use, in addition to having supporting quality system structure. As the core functionality of digital health technology are to collect and manage data, what are the key compliance considerations when using DHTs? Well, ultimately, you want to ensure that GCP requirements for data integrity are implemented throughout the data lifecycle of all records. Elena has already reviewed these principles in more detail in her overview of Alcoa Plus, so I won't go into any further detail here. But to effectively apply data integrity principles requires adequate planning, identifying all DHTs that will be used in the trial, from data capture through reporting, and of course, conducting the appropriate risk assessments. Systems should be designed to support these principles, and sponsors should identify all record formats and interfaces throughout the data flow. Data transfer methods will also need to be defined, tested, and controlled. Having an adequate quality system structure with defined procedures to support these activities is essential for sponsors in order to collect the right data using the appropriate tools. Whether the system that incorporates digital health technology is fairly simple or more complex, start by following a few key compliance fundamentals. These include defining and controlling data flow, establishing effective risk identification and management procedures, establishing systems to ensure DHTs are validated for their intended use, implementing adequate quality system procedures and training, and applying risk-appropriate system controls and oversight. The following case study is based on an inspection conducted at a sponsor and was focused on an open trial. There were several major inspection observations noted during this inspection, and what I will present is abbreviated and simplified for illustration purposes to demonstrate the importance of applying the fundamental requirements we just discussed. This case involves the use of digital health technology as part of a hybrid system. In this example, the sponsor did not validate their EDC software before using it to develop an eCRF for data capture during the trial. The rationale provided for not validating the system was that the sponsor was using and relying only on data collected on paper CRFs provided to investigator sites. The sponsor explained that the eCRF was used only as a tool for communication between the sites and the sponsor, and the systems were separate and used in parallel. But instead of having two independent parallel systems as described, what was implemented was a hybrid system that included digital health technology without supporting validation. This resulted in multiple data integrity issues which were noted during the inspection. In the next two slides, I'll provide an overall description of how the sponsor's data capture system was structured and implemented at the investigator sites. The data capture tools provided by the sponsor are illustrated here, and they include paper CRFs for manual entry of data, and also include user access accounts to the electronic version of the study CRF. As pictured here, it may seem that the two processes could proceed in parallel as described by the sponsor, but I'll show you how these tools are actually used at sites. So according to instructions provided by the sponsor, the investigator sites completed the paper case report forms manually, which involved transcription of data from source records. Once the manual entries were complete, then this data was further transcribed from the paper to the electronic CRF. And to support the entries in the unvalidated system, the paper case report forms were scanned and then uploaded as attachments. So the paper clip that you see here is a virtual one. Now, just take a moment to test your risk assessment skills. What are the risks of implementing the system design? See if you can predict some of the resulting deficiencies. I'll just give you a few seconds to think about this before we continue. Now, I'm not going to ask for feedback here, but perhaps some of you were able to anticipate one or more of the deficiencies that emerged during the conduct of this study. Some of the deficiencies noted during the inspection were related to the creation of duplicate records during data collection, the creation of divergent records, and linked to this, compromised data integrity. Then the scope of use of the electronic system changed over time. And all in all, it was challenging to reconcile all of the study records. So how did this come about? Well, let's take a closer look at what happened at the sites. I think it's safe to say that most, if not all, investigator sites are used to working with electronic CRFs. Paper CRFs are still used occasionally, but we don't see them used very often anymore. This example was definitely a unique situation. I think it makes for a good discussion on data integrity, but the setup wasn't ideal for investigator site staff. The use of both systems with an additional requirement to scan and upload completed paper CRFs caused confusion, and understandably so. The additional requirement didn't make sense, and the instructions for data entry and uploads provided by the sponsor referred to the electronic system as the validated eCRF. So what we saw was that paper case report forms were often incomplete. The data may have been entered manually, but the site staff didn't sign or date many of the entries before the data was transcribed into the electronic system. So normally when working with an eCRF, data entries are automatically dated and timestamped, and entries are attributable to data entry personnel through their user accounts. And this is retained as metadata within the system itself. So even though the paper forms had provision to capture this information, sites often just entered the data values as they would in an eCRF without always manually recording this information to demonstrate who made the entry and when it was made. So we know we can't rely on the integrity of the data entered into the eCRF without supporting validation. And now we have seen that data collected on the paper case report forms aren't always documented following data integrity principles. So you can start to see how the integrity of the data collected during the study started to deteriorate. Other issues related to records were a result of the design of the system itself, combined with inadequate controls, lack of quality system procedures, and associated training. So based on the design of the system, every time the paper CRFs were scanned, the sites were actually creating an uncontrolled copy of the case report form. Paper CRFs were scanned and uploaded in various stages of completion, and there were no restriction on the creation or use of these copies, such as procedural controls or staff training. And this is how divergent records were created. There were examples where the uncontrolled copies previously uploaded were printed by a study coordinator who then manually wrote additional information on the printouts. So again, due to lack of control, this had a major impact to data integrity. Now, the sponsor had stated their intention was to rely on data captured on the paper CRFs. and that the electronic system would not be used for study-related decisions. It was only a communication tool supported by paper records. Well, once a system was being used, we all know how much more convenient it is to handle data in an electronic system. The sponsor soon started to take advantage of this functionality, perhaps forgetting that the system was not validated at all. But in actuality, it was because of a lack of defined procedural controls for both validation and change management. A defined structure needs to be in place before it can be implemented, and in this case, that structure was deficient. And what happened was the sponsor began to import lab data from the central laboratory into the EDC, and consistent with the theme of lack of validation, the data transfer methods were not defined, tested, and controlled. From there, data was exported from the EDC and used to prepare data listings that were provided to the Independent Data Monitoring Committee. So the IDMC was making study-related decisions based on the data managed by digital health technology that was not validated for its intended use. This was one of the more significant observations noted during this inspection that required action from the sponsor. So what were the primary contributing factors to the deficiencies described in this case? Well, they include, the most obvious one is that the sponsor did not validate the EDC software used for data capture in the study. And the sponsor failed to identify and manage risks associated with the data flow. There was also a lack of data governance procedures in place to ensure data capture followed data integrity principles. So in summary, the take-home message from this case is that digital health technologies should be designed and used with data integrity principles in mind. In this case, if the sponsor had incorporated some of the compliance fundamentals we discussed into their quality system structure and applied them, the sponsor could have avoided some of the resulting deficiencies found during the inspection. So remember the importance of understanding and defining data flow, identifying and managing risks, validating all digital health technologies for their intended use, and implementing adequate controls, including comprehensive quality system procedures and training. And one other important note is that when significant issues are found during our inspections, we may share this information with our partners in FDA and MHRA. Hello, partners. So that brings my, advance here. That brings my section of the presentation to an end. So thank you for listening. And now I'll turn things over to Mandy Budwell-Jaggett to present her case study, which I know you will find very interesting.
Thanks, Debbie, and hello, everybody. So I'm going to present a case study from an inspection that I conducted, which really highlights the importance of data integrity control processes and the impact that this can have if all of these fall down. So just to cover what I'm going to cover. So this is a case study of a critical data integrity finding from a CRO inspection. So that's a contract research organization inspection. It will highlight how one design error led to a cascade of failures and lack of control processes to maintain the integrity of the trial data of a very pivotal trial. Now, it was quite a complex finding. There were multiple critical findings, so actually 4. I'm going to present 2 of them, and I'm going to try and do it within 12 minutes. So let's see if I can do that challenge in the time. If only the inspection was just as quick. So I have simplified some of the main learning points just so I can get the main key points across. So I'll give you a brief background. I think it's important for context. I'll go over the first critical finding, which is about data integrity control processes, and this relates to database lock procedures. It relates to access controls and audit trails. We required an impact assessment. It didn't finish there. We had to go back and give a second critical finding for data integrity itself, which I will talk through. And I'll go through what actions were required and hopefully some lessons we can learn from this as well. And then to summarize with some closing thoughts. Okay, so I think it's important to understand the background and the context of this trial and why we were inspecting. So we were doing one of our routine GCP systems inspection of a CRO and selected one of these trials. So this trial that I was looking at was selected as an example to see how the CRO followed their procedures. It was a trial in a rare disease in a pediatric population. Sadly, it has a fatal outcome, and the average participant doesn't make it to their teenage years. There's no other treatment options available. Parents of the participants were really pinning their hopes on this drug working, and there were patient groups dedicated to finding treatment options out there. So there was a lot of patient interest in this trial. So at the time of the inspection, an interim analysis had already been taken, and that was a primary analysis for the study, which was going to be used to support a licensing submission. The primary endpoint was a clinical outcome assessment questionnaire performed by the clinician, which looked at symptoms, and each of these symptoms were weighted for a final score, which was taken at baseline and subsequent visits, so you could compare the change over time. And at the inspection, we realized that a marketing authorization application submission was planned for the following year. Told you there's more background and context. It's quite a complex one, so stay with me on this one. So as I mentioned, that there was a lot of patient interest. This is a rare population. It's a genetic disease. So once a participant was identified, the sponsor had decided that as we wait for the interventional trial to come online, we'll have a non-interventional study, which was a run-in study. And they had decided to reduce duplication and effort, that the end of study visit data from the run-in study could be used as the screening visit data for this interventional trial. Okay, hopefully everybody's still with me, and online you're with me as well. So that's important to bear in mind. Some more background information. So I'm a data person. I need to see things. I'm visual. I needed a data flow to help me understand this. So at site, you had the clinical outcome assessment questionnaire, which the clinician would be completing at the visit. And this was typically a paper questionnaire, and it was the source record. The site would enter this data into the electronic case report form. However, they were also entering demographic data for the patients into an IRT system, which is an interactive response technology system. So we had data going into two different systems, which then came back into the clinical database that was used for the analysis and reporting in the clinical study report. So let's not forget about that run-in study, the non-interventional study that I mentioned. That had a separate ECRF and a separate EDC system. And so they had decided to transfer the data, that the data managers would do this and take the data from the end of study visit in the run-in study and enter it into the ECRF for this one. Now, I'm sure some of you are already risk assessing this and are coming up with some potential issues they could find. So let's see what happened next. So I had selected this trial because the analysis had been done, it was reported, and we thought, great, we can use it to look at data management processes. Let's look at database lock. So the first thing I find is that the database has been locked and unlocked 5 times, and 3 of these were post-unblinding of the data. Now, at this point, my spidey sensors went off. Yes, all inspectors do have spidey sensors, just putting that out there. And then I found that they were analyzing the data, which was meant to be blinded, after unblinding. So now there's a potential to have significant bias in this trial. So I thought, okay, let's see what changed. Let's not panic. Let's go and have a look at the EDC system and see what data was locked, unlocked, what pages, and see if we can reconstruct that. Couldn't do that easily, and I couldn't verify that. So there's a reason why that got extra complicated. So those of you who were keen-eyed and are already risk assessing this process might have anticipated that when data managers were entering the data from the run-in study into this study, they had edit rights to the ECRF to do that. And at the time of the inspections, their rights had not been revoked. So they still had access rights, and it wasn't restricted just to the visit 1 data either. So I thought, okay, don't panic. Let's look at the audit trails. That will tell me what's going on and everything will be fine. So asked for the audit trails. Nobody had ever seen the audit trails before. A request had to be sent to the EDC vendor saying, do we have audit trails? Yes, we do. But they were just in an unsuitable format and didn't facilitate review. Worst thing, they only went back 3 months, and that wasn't good enough. I needed to see it from the start of the study. So clearly nobody had been looking at these audit trails. And then I thought, well, okay, let's ask for the IRT audit trail as well, then, seeing as there's data being entered into that. Now, at the time of the inspection, the IoT had been decommissioned and taken offline. Nobody remembered to get the audit trails, so that would take a significant amount of work of bringing the system back up online to then get the audit trails from it. Don't think they were going to turn around that document request within a few hours. So they got a critical finding from data integrity control processes. So that's the first critical. We thought, okay, we're going to issue that. We will let you do an impact assessment. You got a chance to go and get the audit trails for us, and we'll come back. And then I brought the cavalry with me. Andy came with me. We then thought, okay, let's have a look at the data further. We had got so far, I was still on data management processes, and actually we wanted to have a look at the statistical analysis and query the reporting further. And so we thought, okay, let's see if we can see if any of this data has actually been changed for this primary endpoint. And then we found evidence of there was queries raised on a data point. So previously this had been SDV'd by the monitor as missing. And then after unblinding, a query was raised to the site, and then there was a data point. So we weren't quite sure how that happened. So again, we're now thinking there's significant potential for bias to be introduced to the trial data. They did get some audit trails to us. Unfortunately, these weren't any better. They were a bit better, I'm not going to lie, but then what we did find was another issue, that there were manual changes which site staff could be doing, and they'll show who did what when, but they were showing us system changes. And it later turned out that this was a bug within the EDC vendor system. So the CRO had subcontracted that part out, and the CRO or the sponsor had not been notified of this bug either. Okay, so I'm sure you're wondering, how on earth did this happen? So it all came down to one simple eCRF design error. So one of the primary endpoint questions could have multiple answers to the question. So you could have more than one symptom that you were experiencing in relation to that question. Unfortunately, the eCRF was designed to only allow you to put one symptom in. And so those symptoms had weighting which would impact the score. And that hadn't been identified through any QC checks or any validation of the eCRF, or through monitoring, which was 100% source data verified, by the way. There was no blinded analysis performed of the data to get the tables ready in a blinded form to see, oh, does the data look okay if we compare this with the run-in study? And then we also know that the run-in study, the trial end of study data was being entered as screening data in this trial by CRO staff, and that had not been risk assessed at all, with having mitigations and control processes in place. And there was no risk assessment at all of the trial, the design, the technology, you name it. So we needed some action. So they've got two critical findings at this point. We issued them to the CRO who we were inspecting, but we also wrote to the sponsor, and we wanted a response from them as well. We let other regulatory agencies that we were working with closely about the findings as well, because we knew that they were also planning to submit to them. Hello, friends? And we also then thought, hang on a minute, this is a pivotal trial and the participants don't have any other option. So what can we do? We went and spoke to our assessors in the licensing division to say, when this comes through for your assessment, what information do you need? Can this be saved? What corrective and preventative actions would you need to see? So our licensing assessor said, well, we would need an impact assessment. We need to clearly see all the data changes from before they unblinded the data to the analysis, see what had changed, explain it, and do a sensitivity analysis. And that had to be submitted with a marketing authorization application. It had to be transparently described in the clinical study report, and also in the covering letter for the marketing authorization application. So some points I wanted to highlight was that the CRO had SOPs and procedures that would prevent this, but they didn't follow it. They came under pressure because they made a mistake, and mistakes do happen, we know that. But then the sponsor was asking for all these remedies, and they just didn't follow their procedures after that. There were a lack of quality control checks to ensure the integrity of the trial data, and there was no risk assessment performed at the start, during, or when the issue was identified to see if any potential bias could be minimized. And there was no impact assessment of when they did realize it either. Okay, so to summarize, hopefully this shows the importance of mapping out your critical data flow and looking at your validation and quality control steps along the way so that you can ensure the reliability of your data. Now, the CRO staff were entering data into the ECRF, which is the investigator's ECRF. And that is a delegated and authorized activity by the investigator. And as you can imagine, that had not been requested or authorized by any of the investigators on the trial. So again, going back to audit trails, one of the questions we get a lot is, oh, what do you expect us to look at for the audit trails? Hopefully I've given you an example of why I requested the audit trail. I had a question I wanted answering. So when you're looking at audit trails, or in your organizations what questions do you want answering, and how is that audit trail going to help you do that? We're not expecting you to read an audit trail line by line, because that would be boring and it would take forever. So also, you can identify your critical to quality factors and data points in your risk assessment. What you need to do is also consider the technology, your processes, and your access rights with that. And if something goes wrong, like we said, we're human, things do go wrong. Take a minute, breathe, risk assess it, undertake an impact assessment, and if required, report it either as a protocol deviation, serious breach if it meets the reporting criteria, and it should be transparently described in the clinical study report. So I want to close this with an important thought for all of you. Now, whilst it may seem that I'm getting into the nitty-gritty of detail and process and data flows and all of that, I think it's important to ensure that these findings can have a true impact. Now, remember, there were parents who were pinning their hopes on this drug to potentially save or prolong their child's life, and they had no other options. And the participants of these trials are the heroes, really, of undertaking these trials, undergoing the assessments and the invasive procedures to really answer a very important question of, does the drug work and is it safe? And can the risk-benefit profile be established for the licensing regulators to authorize that product so it could go to other patients in future? And by not having these processes in place, you can result in patient harm or your data not being accepted for marketing authorization application that could impact patients in future. So when you're designing your processes, and sometimes we can get really busy in our day-to-day lives of process and trials and meetings and emails, it's really important to really think about the real impact on patients and those parents who are waiting for this product as it may have potentially saved their child's life. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you, and I'll hand over to Debbie.
Thank you, Mandy. That brings session 2 to a close. So I just want to extend a big thank you to my team members, Mandy and Elena. We will be happy to address questions related to our session during the Q&A panel discussion at the end of the day. So please submit your questions online. And now I'd like to hand things over to Dr. Karen Bleich, the moderator for session 3, Clinical Trials with Decentralized Elements and GCP Inspections.